Brian O'Gallagher is unavoidably has to be outside the city, so I've been designated as the man to introduce our speaker this evening. Stephen Cameron is a member of the board of Irish Heritage Quebec, and he's also the president of Cornell Kilsha, an Irish heritage group up in county of Lotbiniere. And Steve is a graduate of Concordia University. He's had a successful career with Canada Post and the transportation system in Quebec City, long before it came under threat. And he's going to talk to you tonight about the Corgan murder. Without further ado, Stephen.
Two quick comments. I'm always amused when someone calls me Stephen, because that's what my mother would call me when I'm in trouble, or my wife, Stephen. Most of the time I'm just Steve. And the second thing, I'm always amused when people clap before I do anything. It's also a good news story. This is a little bit of a different circumstance for me, because it's a little bit meaningful. And at the end of the presentation, you'll get a sense as to why this one's so important. I specifically made a mention here, a special thank you to Mariana. She was a little bit behind this, and I'll give you a quick summary of that at the tail end of the presentation, but I figured I better get through the presentation first. Just a quick synopsis of what the picture is on here. After I did a fair amount of work on this story in the 2008, 2009, up until about 2013, 14. And after I wrote a book on it, and very shortly thereafter, somebody called me and said, "Do you have the original?" And I had a copy of this taken off the web and printed out. And I said, "What original?" He told me. So I ended up by finding this. This is an original 1856 document. It's 113 pages. Rather biased, so it has a different view, because this story, as you'll see, has almost two views of everything, and this is one of them. But it's really interesting because it has a lot of specific quotes out of some of the journalists reporting at the time, and then there's some editorial comment. And it's the editorial comment that sort of gets a little bit biased. The second reason why I like it a fair amount, I've always had insinuations that some of my ancestors were involved, and I found them in the trial transcripts, but this book says their names, and I went, oh, that's another reason why I want this book. So they're a little bit, without knowing it, this story became a little bit more personal than I thought it would when I started out. So without further ado, we'll get into it. The first thing, I think, just to give you some ideas to where are we talking about. This is an area, it's primarily at the time called St. Sylvester, and right beside it was an area called Leeds. The names have changed a little bit these days, but they're basically at the bottom end about 30 miles from Quebec City. Today, when I left home, it took me exactly 42 minutes to the bridge. At the time, and you'll hear why when I talk about delays of getting back to Quebec, it would be a day to get back to Quebec at the time. And the other thing is, obviously, there was no troisième lien, nor a second or a first, right? There was no lien at all. So people had to get to the bridge or get to the water and hope that the tides were going the right way. So it was a long trip to get back to Quebec City. And so as you can see on this screen, I've purposely painted the green is sort of where most of St. Sylvester is. And that's primarily, at the time, primarily Irish Catholic. A few French Canadians and a few Irish Protestants, but primarily an Irish Catholic area. Neighboring Leeds, where I've put the orange, was almost 90% Irish Protestant with a few Scots. So there was really almost a distinction as to where they actually settled. And again, there's always some exceptions, but that's more or less where it occurred. The second thing I would say, that just staying with the Irish for a second, this area that's where you see it, the Craigs Road, the lower road, that opens up in about 1810. And there's really nobody there, though, until the late 18s and then early 1820s. And the second road you see above it is marked the Gosford, which opens up 1832. And part of the reason for that opening of the second road was everything along the Craigs Road is hilly, incredibly hilly. So when I talked in a few minutes, I'm going to mention something called the Handkerchief and Mount St. Margaret's. These are mountains that are 2,500 feet. And when you get down to that area where the Gosfords start, it's maybe 50 feet above sea level. So there's really a distinction. In fact, one of the things, I'm always finding something new about this story. The other day I found a document. They referred to the road that goes to the St. Sylvester as the road to the mountain. They didn't even call it the Craig's Road, and I thought that was amusing. But when you're driving along the road today, that's exactly what's happening. So everything in that green and orange is extremely high, which allows for people to hide, right? Everything on the other plot is pretty flat. And today what's really amusing, if you look at from just about the Craig's Road right back to the river, is flat. I would put money on how many Irishmen you could see that settled that. They literally settled in the hills. So strange as it sounds, they followed these hills, and parts of St. Sylvester and Leeds actually look like County Cork, County Kilkenny. It looks like home, so it was an easy place for them to go. Prior to those two things, the only thing that was really there were the First Nations. And First Nations were there, both Abenaki, primarily on the western side of this picture, or the Huron, which would have been on the eastern side. So people are coming down the Chaudière River and ending up into parts of St. Sylvester. So we do have some evidence of First Nations, and there's almost no permanent settlement of First Nations in that area. So it's a pretty rough area at the time, rough physically. It's up to 2,500 feet in places, and very much exactly the opposite of what today's farming would require, right? So it's not surprising today you don't find too many farms versus at the time. The second thing that you notice is that the waves of Irish really started in the 1820s. So these are all pre-famine Irish, right? So a bit like Shannon, and probably a little bit like other places north of Quebec City. So unlike the city, it's all pre-famine people. But when I say pre-famine come in the 1820s, that means a lot of them are born in 1780, 1790. So you wonder, well, what were they like? So you can't understand this specific story without having an understanding of what was happening there, what was happening in Ireland in the 1700s. And it gives you and I'm going to do a real quick 100-year summary of the history of Ireland, but you'll see what an impact it had once they brought that baggage with them when they brought it over. So in the late 1700s, or the early 1700s, sorry, after the Battle of the Boyne, when William of Orange defeats James the Catholic, and they start moving in and putting in something called the penal laws. The penal laws are basically, and again, don't take any exception, or please don't take exception to my commentary about something being either pro or anti-Catholic or Protestant. I'm just trying to give you the facts of what the story is. The penal laws, I've never seen anybody say that they were very pro-Catholic when you hear what the conditions were. So they're pretty negative. So for example, you couldn't land could not be given from father to son. You couldn't have a horse of a certain size. You couldn't have a gun. You couldn't be in certain jobs. You couldn't, and there's a lot of couldn'ts. You couldn't even build a church on a main road. If you did build a church, it had to be sort of like in the woods and made of wood. There's all sorts of silly things. You weren't allowed to have a Catholic priest in there. So just not a very nice place for Catholics to be, despite the fact that in the 1600s, they still were the majority landowner. By the end of the 1700s, despite being 80–85% of the population, they're owning less than 5 to 10% of the land. So they lost their land. So if you've lost your land and you've had all of these other things happen to you, you're probably not a happy camper. What's interesting is that it took time, though, despite of all this, it took time before there was like a resistance movement that started to appear in primarily rural Ireland. And things like something called the White Boys, the Ribbonmen, the Molly Maguires, the Defender, a whole pile of these little agrarian rural groups started fighting for their rights against the landlord. And who's the landlord? Well, it's some English guy, somebody from England, or somebody who's Protestant. It's not one of us, most of the time. There's always exceptions. So they started, and they weren't very nice people at times. It started off by the simple things like killing people's animals, or cutting their ears off, or chopping their Achilles tendon. And then they started attacking the people who are looking after the Protestant cows and horses. So it just gradually, so it's a rough thing. So there's a baggage that comes with these ribbonmen. In 1791, there's a pile of both Catholics and Protestants who decide that what we really do need here is something that is not based on religion. We need something that's just being Irish. And this was seen favorably by a number of Catholic organizations, but very unfavorably by the British government, and certainly unfavorable by a lot of the Orangemen. And so this United Irishman quickly became persona non grata in Ireland. At the same time, if you're Protestant and you're a smaller amount of the population, you're 10 to 15% of the population, you own 80% of the place, but everyone around you, more or less, my expression, sort of hates your guts. So they started banding themselves together to defend themselves. And they formed in 1795 in County Armagh something called the Orange Lodge. And that Orange Lodge became, even to this day, the Orange Lodge has an incredible role in Northern Ireland. And in the 1800s here in Canada, the Orange Lodge played a significant role, primarily in Ontario. But we have remnants of it here in St. Sylvester, as you're going to see in a few minutes. 1796 to 98, rebellion in Ireland. 3 areas are open warfare: County Wexford in the southeast, County Mayo on the west coast, and County Antrim in the northeast. All 3 cases totally uncoordinated, all 3 put down by the British eventually, and the rebels are basically wiped out in the last battle, the Battle of Ballinamuck, where the French had landed in County Mayo and had some early success with some of the local Irish. They finally get wiped out in Ballinamuck, and the Brits make a deal with the French soldiers. The soldiers and Colonel Humbert, who was in charge, will swap and send you back to France, and the British and the Irish soldiers are basically massacred and killed. So again, not a very successful rebellion. I don't think there's any successful rebellion in Ireland, and there's no live heroes. They all die. Like all of these guys that are the heroes in Ireland are guys that end up by being hanged or shot or quartered or something. 1801, 1802 is the Act of Union. So as a result of this, the British government wipes out, through all sorts of coercion, the government that was acting in Ireland, and Act of Union means that there's no more Irish Parliament. So that's what some of our first ancestors lived through, right? Especially those that were born at 1770, 1780. We have lots of people in our area that come from County Mayo. They would have succumbed to some of the worst of this. A lot of people in the St. Malachy area came from County Wexford, County Waterford area. Same thing, they would have suffered quite a bit. At the same time here, the place is empty in 1815. So the war with Napoleon is over, and all of a sudden we start getting these floods. By 1850, the place is full. When I say full, I'm talking about the area that I'm referring to on the maps. That's that St. Sylvester, St. Agathe, St. Patrick's de Beaurivage, Leeds, Inverness area. It goes from empty to full. So think of massive waves of immigration of all kinds of people coming in a very large way all at once. So the social change in religion certainly added extra stress to the community. So it sort of feels a lot like home. So that's what we find our settlers, that's their baggage. So we start to see some early tensions, and the early ones that are well documented, the 1840s. That obviously means that there's probably stuff beforehand that isn't as well documented. But we see some things that are giving us an indication that things aren't getting any better. If anything, it's just like home. The one on the left is an Orange Lodge in 1840. We have evidence that in 1830 to 32 that there's some Orange Lodge activity in what today is Kinnair's Mills, but was at the time Leeds. So that would have been at the western part of that orange blob that I showed you, the western part. And they had a number of various lodges. And in 1840, though, they got the first official recognized lodge, recognized from, I call it head office in County Armagh, and it's a guy named Lowry is the one that's put as in charge, and it's called the Purple Hill Lodge, and this is actually a ribbon from that original Purple Hill Lodge, so that ribbon dates from 1840. What was interesting, though, is when you want to celebrate and you want to party being an Orangeman, it's not a lot of fun partying alone. So you go 15, 20 miles to St. Sylvester, where it's all Catholic, in order to party. And there's multiple documents suggest that because of that incursion into this Catholic area, that the Catholics ended up by turning around and creating their own Ribbonmen organization, which is again like that agrarian support group that's going to defend Catholics against the Orangemen. So we start to see some evidence of that. The first time we see concrete evidence of something similar to that actually involves a priest, and you'll see him up on the wall over here, James Nelligan. A young James Nelligan is in St. Sylvester. It's the first time he's in charge of a parish, and he's decided that he's not going to be trampled over by anybody, whether it's Orangemen or even whether it's the Seigneur at the time. So in January 42, we have a fair amount of documentation about a specific polling activity that was occurring where some Orangemen were trying to get through some local legislation through a polling at a polling booth. Well, Nelligan and two lineups of groups of Irishmen with the equivalent of baseball bats appear and sort of disturb the meeting. And Nelligan is accused of actually grabbing the justice of the peace to calm things down. So there's a fair amount of turmoil that occurs on this. What's not clear is it almost looks like a fabricated story to a degree, because I've never found anything other than the allegations. I've never found a court case otherwise, but it gives you a sense that that's what's going on at the time. So by the 1840s, tensions are there, right? And it's no different than what we would have seen in Ireland. Jump forward to 1855 and getting closer to the story. Robert Corrigan is one boy of 8 that was the sons of Patrick and Grace McMulkin from County Tyrone. What's interesting about this is I, like everybody else, said, oh, it's 8 boys, the story, and they all came here. It was only well after the book was written that I found out that the reason why they all came, in my opinion, they had a sister. No one ever talks about the sister, but the sister was in St. Sylvester in 1826. Her name was Anne Corrigan, married to James Galachley from County Tyrone. So my assumption is that the family came here because she was already here and settled. Because no one really had an understanding as to why did they appear in St. Sylvester when they could have went anywhere. So my guess is it's probably because of that. When Robert comes, the rest of the brothers and family are already here. By the time he comes, he's converted. He's now a Protestant. He's no longer a Catholic, and he's a very anti-Catholic person. So he's married a lady named Catherine Morton, and by 1844, they're having kids here in Quebec City. Well documented, the first baptism is at the Holy Trinity, and he's buying land in St. Sylvester in 1845 to 48. And he's known as a fighter. There's lots of evidence of him running into problems with the law beforehand, and usually around battles, some fighting. So he's referred to as a best man. He has some financial problems, and he seems like, one of his descendants asked me one day, they said, it sounds like my ancestor Robert wasn't a very nice man. And I said, no, that's probably true, but the guys that killed him probably weren't nice either. And that sort of put Dennis at ease. But my sense is he wasn't nice, and this is a good example of where he probably isolated himself from both communities. So he's a best man. We have evidence that he was at first, he's referred to as a servant when he's living here in Quebec, but he quickly becomes a farmer. He has a miller, and he's buying and selling horses. So he's doing a little bit of everything by the time this skirmish happens. Early in 1855, he goes to a service at a little chapel on St. Margaret's. St. Margaret's Chapel was sitting on one of these high mountains, St. Margaret's. For anybody who knows St. Sylvester today, it's the one where the radar used to be, and now there's a radar, so that's Mount St. Margaret's, right? So he was on the east side of that, and there was a small chapel there and a lost cemetery that we found. But anyway, he's there, and when he comes out of there, he gets into a fight with 6 of his neighbors. Patrick Big O'Neill, another guy who's known for his fighting abilities. John Harris, Kilfoyle, William Love, Patrick Downey, and George Bannon. What's interesting about the neighbors is that Harris is married to a Protestant. These guys are all Catholic except for Harris and Love. Harris is married to a Protestant lady, and William Love is married to a Catholic. So some mixed marriages on that range, which is the range was almost the top end of the range was all Catholic, the bottom end of the range is all Protestant, and somehow the mixtures happen right in the middle. It's a funny thing how sex has a role to play even back then. So he gets into a fight with them, and basically they surround him, but he gets into a fight primarily with Patrick Big O'Neill. And he claims later that O'Neill tricked him, and it sounds like, if you read all of the evidence, it sounds like O'Neill beat him, but it's a stretch because you can't believe everything you read. So what they did is he threatened to go to the police, and so two other guys get involved, Kilfoyle's father, who's a Catholic, and a guy named Hugh Russell, who's a well-respected Protestant, and the two old guys sit down and make a deal saying, look, tell them to say they're sorry, give him a few dollars, he'll shut up and it'll all go away. So they get this deal, and then once they get the deal, Corrigan goes to the police anyway, right? So all that did was piss off his neighbors, but also some of the people that they thought they had a deal. So he hasn't endeared himself to anybody by this time. So this is in the spring of 1855. Flash forward a few months, agricultural fair, October 17th to 19th. 17th is a Wednesday. This is the third year in a row that there's agricultural fair in St. Sylvester. It's a big thing. Very similar in Ireland, so people come from all around. So easily, by you look at how many people were just pure witnesses, easy to say there's a few hundred people at this event. So it's not, and Catholic and Protestant, so it's a real mixture. It's just about everybody in the community shows up. This is the third year. And Robert Corrigan, for some reason, was chosen to be a judge of sheep at this event. And while he's on the first day, he's judging John McCaffrey's sheep. And he gives John McCaffrey, who happened to be a Catholic from St. Agathe, so he gave his Catholic sheep a second place rather than first place, and McCaffrey takes exception to it. And Corrigan is upset because he's taking exception to it. So he bends over and depends on which version you believe, he either wipes his hands on the back of the sheep or on the ground, and he says, well, I'll wipe my hands of this judging. And when he bends down, he's surrounded and they just beat the blankety blank out of him, right? They just surround him. And again, depending on who you believe, either it's 15 or 20 or 30 people or 4 or 5. It lasted 4 or 5 minutes or half an hour. So it really depends on the story that you're going to hear. And we're going to get into the trial transcript in a few minutes, and you're going to see the distinction between the two. But certainly a sucker punch. He's down on the ground in bad shape, and one of the neighbors ends up by picking up. Things are sort of calming down, and they get him off the grounds and move him across the road to Andrew McKee's place, which is a Protestant neighbor across the road. What's interesting from my perspective and people in the area, so I take them to all these places that some of them own that don't know that this happened at their house, right? So it's always amusing to see people's reactions when they go, it happened here, yeah, it happened here, and you show them the maps and they're not aware of it, so it's always quite amusing. So now on the 17th, which is the Wednesday, Corrigan is over at Andrew McKee's house, and the party goes on. The fair continues. Next day, there's a plowing contest. Everybody's active. Everything's going fine. The two justices of the peace who are on site, they do nothing. This is just like, it's like every other year. There's some fights, there's some drinking. It's called faction fights, right? There's groups get together, have a fight. The plowing match is on, and that evening, John Matchell, who is the president of the agricultural fair, and he's the one that donated the land. And because he donated a separate land, that's why we can be so precise as to where it was, right? It's still a separate piece of land. And so that evening, the president has his annual meeting. Some of the people that eventually get accused are at the meeting. Some of the people that are accusing are at the meeting, and justices of peace are at the meet or at the dinner. So life goes on, everything's fine, but by Thursday night, Corrigan's really struggling and he's in bad shape. So then we have another clerical intervention. We have lots of clericals who seem to want to get involved. This guy, Reverend William King, arrived in St. Sylvester in 1848. He was in Bury near on the way to Sherbrooke before that. Difficult man from England. Difficult, not my words that are well documented by third parties who would have been independent. A very biased anti-Catholic Anglican minister who certainly did not try to calm things down and tried to actually stir things up. And in fact, he's cited as such in one of the inquiries that comes up in a few minutes' time. But what he does is he goes to Corgan, who's in McKee's house, and King lives like a quarter mile from McKee's. So he goes to McKee's and talks to Corgan, and he has the Justice of Peace, Laurent Paquette, who's another neighbor, to sit there and talk about what happened. And he convinces Corrigan to swear out a deposition against who did this to you. And he names the leader, Richard Kelly, who's the leader of the Ribbonmen. And he just happens to be married to James Nelligan's niece. and a very good friend of James Nelligan. We have evidence of that. So Richard Kelly is the lead of the Ribbonmen. Patrick Big O'Neill, the guy that fought in the spring. Patrick, I love this, Patrick Yankee Pat Donahue. Obviously, he spent some time in the States. His cousin Francis Donahue, George Bannon, Patrick Blinking Monahan, and Blinking, another funny, amusing name. Well, there were 4 different Patrick Monahans about the same age, so I guess they had to give him extra clarification as to which Patrick is. That's Blank, and it is in the records, Blinking Monahan. And John McCaffrey, he's my Catholic sheep owner, right? John McCaffrey is a different guy. So he gets the Justice of the Peace to get this deposition, and he sends for a warrant to go after these guys for having beat up Corrigan. But before the police arrive, so don't remember what I said. So this is like on the Thursday, Friday. So they have to come to Quebec to get a warrant, and then they have to go back. Well, by the time he comes, Corrigan's dead, right? So Corrigan dies on Friday afternoon at Andrew McKee's house. So when he gets there, they have to go back to Quebec now to get not only a new warrant, but a warrant and the police, right? So the body's now sitting in Andrew McKee's on the weekend. Thomas Sheridan, this to me is a little bit amusing. Thomas Sheridan is an Irish Catholic guy that lives about half a mile away, further along the Craigs Road. He goes to McKee and says, by the way, do you know that the Catholics are going to rob the body and they're going to stop the coroner, right? And McKee panics. There's no evidence as to whether that's true or whether they were just trying to get him going. They got him going because McKee turns around, talks to William King. King contacts the Orangemen in Leeds, and 250 Orangemen come armed and rob the body and take it back to Leeds. By the time the coroner actually gets there, the body's gone, right? By the time the police get there to look after the accused, they're gone because they've now had 3 or 4 days of time to get away from it. So it's rather amusing to me. The other thing that happens is Corrigan's body disappears, right? So that there's no record of him being buried. Some verbals, there's no documents that says where he is in a church. I'm going to get to a story about some rumors about it. There's no civil records, there's no religious records. It's just Corrigan's body disappears. And I still get calls from one of his descendants, have you found them yet? As if I'm going to find them, and I haven't found them yet. And I'll explain later why I haven't found them yet. I think I know, but there's something stopping me from identifying it. What Coroner Panette does arrive, has the coroner's meeting at the inquest. For those of you, some of you might know St. Jacques de Leeds. There's an old church there called St. James Anglican. It's 1831. It's the oldest building we have in our area. It's fabulous. There was a school right in front of it. So all of what I'm about to talk happens there. It's in front of the church, and it's in front of the church that William King would frequently go to, and there's a school right in front of that. So the autopsy is done there, the coroner's inquest is done there, so it's a pretty important historical site. The coroner's inquest is held there. Almost no Irish Catholics there. All people that were there were the Protestant group and a few French Canadians. The autopsy explains very clearly he died of a rupture of the ilia, which is a piece inside your stomach, so that's what killed him. But there was all sorts of rumors as to what he died of, so he was beat up pretty bad. What we do know specifically is he was 5'10", very well built, powerful man. Every other part of his body was in good shape, other than bruises and this ilia issue. So the fact that he was one of the doctors made the comment that, given his physical condition, it's not surprising that he would have been tough and probably would have been a good fighter if he had the right attitude. And someone else said, well, he had that attitude too, so it worked. What's interesting is at the inquest. They did a lot. It's almost like a court where a number of witnesses declare, but there's no cross-examination or anything. So people come up and start saying, here's what I saw, here's what I saw, here's what I saw. And at the coroner's inquest, they actually added more people than Corgan originally spoke about. They added both Matthew and Hugh Hopkins. They added John Jane Hagan and Edward Donahue, one of the other Donahue's brothers. So they're now up to an extra 4 people who are accused. And Paquette is the Justice of the Peace, and he says something under oath, and he says, Well, I felt Corrigan was telling the truth because he was about to die, right? That's a very critical statement he made, because at the trial, he doesn't say that. He says something different. And Jean-Baptiste Père happens to say, and there was a whole pile of people planning this. I saw them, and he goes on and gives his story. So there's these two French-Canadian guys come back on the actual trial. The mistake I think that the coroner made was he turned around and then deputizes William Harrison with a few of his friends to go out and catch these guys because the cops haven't caught them yet. Well, William Harrison is an avid Orangeman, and he just causes more trouble. He takes off with his friends and does all sorts of silly things up in the hills and gets into trouble for it. And one or two of the people that end up should have been good witnesses were on the run by the time the trial comes. So he did some silly things. So there's all sorts of threats. The accused disappear. The government puts up major awards, and of course the community ignores it. The community is very tight-knit. Harrison, and as I said, gets very aggressive. And the locals get together and sign a petition they sent to the government saying, get these armed Orangemen out of the way. And one of the guys that's the prime mover behind that is Robert Corrigan's brother, Owen. So it's really amusing to me that you see the brother saying he's a nut, so get him out. Like it's a pretty aggressive stance, the petition, and they're certainly against having Orangemen that have been duly deputized by the judiciary to be running around the hills. Dunbar Ross is the Solicitor General at the time, and he's very vocal and goes against and goes out very publicly saying that the community is at fault because they're hiding these killers. Like he's very aggressive. Reverend King creates some rumors by saying there's a hit list of Protestant families that are going to be killed by these Catholics, and that the Ribbonmen are intimidating us. There's little doubt there would have been some intimidation of witnesses, in my opinion, but it was blown out of proportion by the way it was put. The second thing happens is the Orange Press gets involved with this, and they really embarrass the government, saying, you don't know what you're doing, you haven't caught them, it's about time you got them. So they double the rewards, and they send new police force to St. Sylvester. Now again, remember, 2,500 feet, 2,450, two big mountains side by side. So on the 20th of December, they send 150 cops, some from Montreal, some from Quebec, and some from Trois-Rivières to come looking for these guys. Well, needless to say, 4 days before Christmas, they didn't find anybody, and they were anxious to get home. So they're under the charge of a guy named Ermentanger, who's a really high-profile judiciary guy, policeman from Montreal, but they're unsuccessful. And as they're leaving, they're being quite embarrassed by this whole thing, and the newspapers are playing it up. The contingent that leaves to come back to Quebec goes to something called the Craig Road Station. This is a brand new railway station that just opened up in 1854-55. And at the Craig Road Station, they're all on the train. There's a train derailment. And they figure somebody did this on purpose, and they catch two people. One is John Kelly and another guy named Abraham Ramsey. And what's amusing is John Kelly just happens to be the brother of the head of the Ribbonmen, Richard. Right? So they got him, and this is all in the news. We got him. We weren't successful. Well, of course, when they got in front of the actual courts, the courts threw the case out. There was absolutely no evidence whatsoever of a derail. There was evidence of a derailment, but certainly no sabotage. So it was, again, the government very much embarrassed. But in my words, winter's coming. So now we're December. In St. Sylvester, even today, on average, we get 12 feet of snow a winter, right? It's pretty blustery up there. So on the 7th, between the 7th and 17th, all the guys, there's some wheelie dealing going on. All of them give up, and they say, we'll give ourselves up if we have a quick trial. Because one of the concerns they had is if you go in too early, end of November, December, you could be in jail until before you get to the spring assize, which is the next sitting of the courts. So we'll go in if we get a quick trial. Well, they gave themselves up in early January, mid-January, and they had a trial by the end of the month, beginning of February. Before they got there, Donoghue, Hopkins, and Hopkins, they were released. There was no bill. So these guys, three of the four guys that were identified at the coroner's report with evidence, there was no evidence. The court threw out the case, and you had no case. For the Crown, Dunbar Ross, the Solicitor General, was the one in charge of, and so he's going to prosecute. He's the prosecutor at the trial. Very confident, very sure that they were convinced they were all guilty, right? Because the coroner said he was guilty, we're going to get them. What appears to be the case is they did very little prep of any of the witnesses, and it'll show, as you'll see in a few minutes. For the defense, there was a young lawyer named John O'Farrell, who's from Quebec City, and he just had a very successful career start by being one of the major guys to get the Irish Catholics free during the Gavazi riots here about a year or two earlier than that here in Quebec City. So he's a really good, young, bright, aggressive, maybe not always kosher lawyer, but a really good defense lawyer. So John O'Farrell is leading a group of 3 or 4 lawyers who's going to defend them. And Judge Duval, who has a really good reputation, is in charge of it. Some elements that are worthwhile hearing about, only because it sort of makes us laugh by today's standards. You got to put yourself at the time. Jury selection, O'Farrell took all the time necessary to find the right jurors. Does that sound familiar? Today's world, right? So at the time it wasn't, you just put some people there and you're the jurors. And he made sure, and he dragged it out to bore everybody. I wanted to make sure that there was some French Canadians, wanted everything done in both languages, which just drove Dunbar Ross crazy. So he took his time. Afterwards, they accused him of finding ribbonmen. That's what he was trying to find Fenians to put into the jury box. That's what he was claimed. And there's some dynamics that are amusing. The accused are sitting in a row. They would change hats, they'd change sheets so while this is going on. The room was packed with a lot of their supporters. So it's a little bit farcical by our standards today, but at the time, that appears to be the case. Poor preparedness by the Crown, for sure. Almost a heavy dependence on the fact that all those people that spoke at the corners are going to say the same thing and it'll be the same conclusion. Whereas O'Farrell was wicked with his cross-examination. And my humble opinion is everyone lied, right? So I can read the transcripts and tell you if they're Catholic or Protestant, right? So the Protestant said there was like 50 guys and it lasted half an hour. The Catholics said it was 3 minutes and there were 4 guys, or we didn't know who it was. Like it was just, it's almost that silly. But the testimony all looks very suspicious, my opinion. The defense had in a way, almost an easier time of it because O'Farrell, as I said, was very task-focused and very, very effective. Lots of evidence that Richard Kelly wasn't anywhere near the actual beating. And he had some really good witnesses that had some credibility, French-Canadian witnesses in particular, that post them about 400, 500 feet away from the actual beating at the time where they were actually judging some mayors. Everybody seemed to search the truth. And then they got Paquette to change his story. O'Farrell said, well, I thought you said that he was feeling not too bad, Corrigan, when you took the deposition. Oh yeah, he was doing pretty well. He felt he was going to get through it, which is exactly opposite of what he said at the coroner's report. So his deposition ended up by being thrown out, right? It was non-applicable. The second thing is they got Napier to actually contradict himself. And Jean-Baptiste Napier has more of a history, so he's not somebody who was very credible. He was a friend of the Orangemen because he was working for them at the time. He didn't own any land, and he was so he was working for a neighbor. And he ended up by admitting that he had repeated what he had heard versus actually hearing it. So he not very good. The other thing that O'Farrell was really good at, he would listen to one of the witnesses, the Crown's witness, say, well, Richard Kelly said blah, blah, blah. And he'd turn around and say, well, who's Richard Kelly? And he would point to Patrick Blinking Monaghan, right? And then he would, and where someone's, oh, well, it was Patrick Monaghan, will point to somebody. So they had 3 people did that specifically where they misrepresented people that they said they had identified. So it hurt them badly. One of the major, another Crown witness, a guy named Stewart, created perjury on the stand within 48 hours, was thrown out, so again, hurt the Crown. 2 French Canadians changed their stories, and there was 1 or 2 other guys that they were wanting to use as witnesses, but they were on the run from their silliness with William Harrison, so that did not help their case. So the judge turns around and when this is all over, they've all done their summations, and you can imagine what Corrigan saying, not Corrigan, sorry, what Dunbar Ross is saying, and you can imagine already what John O'Farrell is saying. It was almost, when you read the summary by Ross, you can almost see him pointing fingers at the justice of the peace for changing his story. You could almost sense that he had a sense that he's about to lose this. Anyway, the jury took 8 hours, come back, they're all found not guilty, right? So now the Irish Catholics in St. Sylvester are partying, and the Irish Protestants in St. Sylvester are really pissed off, right? So it's not a nice solution from a community standpoint, but that's the two stories. And I can tell you, even to this day, I can bring you to certain houses and you'll hear one story versus another, and you can tell what religion they were. There's some of them still permeates in the area. It's really quite amusing. The interesting thing is the press really took off on this and became high profile. If it was high profile with the trial, what comes next is taking it to another level. About the only newspaper that I saw that seemed to sort of take a rather unbiased view of it was actually the Montreal Herald, and their conclusion was the identity of the accused was not proven by the evidence. So what they're basically saying is it isn't that these guys weren't guilty, it's just that the evidence that was shown certainly didn't point at them. So it was almost like the jury had no choice based on the evidence of saying that they were not guilty. And in my mind, I always said it would have been hard, my opinion is that it would have been hard to find them guilty given what occurred. But there's little doubt in my mind that some of the guys were involved with the actual beating. And Bud O'Farrell really did a superb job. And in fact, O'Farrell was able to carry this with him for some time as being a kudo. But Corgan never dies. And then the story just went to another level. And this, you have to remember, this is pre-Canada. But there were interventions coming out of Toronto, primarily from two people. One, John Hillier Cameron, a very avid, high-profile Orangeman and politician, no relationship to this Cameron, and George Brown, a politician and newspaperman. And their basic pressure on the government was, how can a Protestant get a fair trial in Quebec? It's a terrible place to go. Blah blah blah. Put a lot of pressure on the government at the time, McNabb and Taché. They were already on shaky grounds, and this almost toppled them. But what happened is John A. Macdonald ended up by getting into position to replace McNabb, and he became, as you know, a rather important politician in our history. But he did two things right away. The first thing he did was a government inquiry, so he bought time. And the second thing is he sent a stipendiary constable. Like, I was wondering, what was a cop going to do amongst this silliness? But he named this guy Ralph Johnson, and he sends it. And Johnson has a phenomenal impact. And at the time, I'll talk a little bit about him in a few minutes. At the time, I didn't know why he was so effective. I think I understand now, but he certainly calmed things down relatively quickly. So he did something to appease both communities fairly quickly. So this inquiry, though, ended up by taking quite some time. It lasted a few years. 47 witnesses, 14 locals, 2 interim reports. But just as they were about to release the report, one of the guys that was being accused was John James Hagan, and he never gave up. And he was one of the guys who was always up hiding somewhere, and they caught him. So he had to go to another trial. So here we go, another trial is repeated, and it's almost a carbon copy of the first trial. It's a bit ridiculous because it's almost the same witnesses. Dunbar Ross takes the same approach. O'Farrell destroys all the witnesses, and he's found not guilty. Like, it's just silly. They eventually let the report go in 1855, and almost all of it just focuses blame on the justice of the peace. There's almost none of the deep dive analysis of what was supposed to be, what started this, why wasn't it kept under control. It almost looked like it's all of Paquette's fault. It was almost all him. And so what they ended up by doing, though, is they bought time. So from that 1855 to about 1860 time period, most people sort of think things were calm. I'm not one of those people, and I'll give you some examples. So this sort of, from the pure standpoint of the Corrigan story, that's more or less where it ends. But as I said, Corrigan never dies. As I said, things kept on going, and the fun thing about this story is it has so many tangents, and I'm going to just walk through a few of them to give you a feel of it. Very similar to a number of our ancestors, when Robert Corrigan came here, he would have probably had a hard time writing his name and would use an X. And this first signature on the top left is the first time I saw him actually write his name. And it's Robert Corgan. He spelt it wrong, but it's an effort. The upper left, he actually spells it, because every document prior to that one, it was just an X. And if you notice on his right-hand side, his wife is actually signed with an X. So he wrote Corgan. So this is in the early 1852. By 1855, in the spring, after the spring skirmish, he signed his name, Robert Corgan, on below. So it's interesting, despite this guy with all of his difficulties, he was trying to do better for himself. And this is one of the spins I've given to some of his descendants, saying he was still trying to do better, he was learning. So all of a sudden he became a little bit literate. The picture on the right is John O'Farrell. He's buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery here. He's fascinating. I've got a fiction book written about him, and it's a great story, but a lousy writing, so it's sitting on the desk. But O'Farrell has gotten into all sorts of other troubles. He very active with some Fenians in the 1860s. Lots of rumors about how active he was involved with the murder of, with the assassination of D'Arcy McGee. So he's an interesting character, and very, very complex character, and he's fascinating. I'm going to bring up another issue to him shortly. One of the things that's interesting about him is if you look at the maps of 1860, 70, and 80 at home, whether you're in St. Sylvester or Leeds, everywhere where there's speculation about a mine, he has land. So it's almost like he knew where it was all going to be, so he's got land all over the place. He must have 15 hunks of land all over this place. But one in particular is of interest that I'll talk to you in a minute. This is a headstone of John McCaffrey, my chap with the Catholic sheep on the left. He's buried in St. Agathe. He's also would have been, if he was still alive today, he'd be almost my next door neighbor. Handkerchief and O'Farrell. The story of the handkerchief is fascinating. When I was a kid, my uncle would go and visit all these old guys, and I'd hear these stories of murders and stuff. And this Corrigan murder, I asked him one day, well, where were they hiding if they were all hiding? And one of the old guys said, up in the handkerchief. And I didn't, no, a kid, you just put it back, and meant nothing to me at the time. And I went for a long time not finding, when I actually did some research on this, trying to get ready for the book, I couldn't find anybody in the handkerchief. But where was John James Hagan eventually caught? On the handkerchief. Second thing I found is 3 weeks before, I'm going to repeat this to make sure I make the dates hit you. 3 weeks before the trial, John O'Farrell sells his land on the handkerchief to the Daly family. Just by chance, he owned land in the most rugged part of the handkerchief. The rumors were that they were hiding up there. I wonder if they were hiding on his land. So it's a wonder. I have no facts, but I know that he sold land up there right beforehand. The hit squad. This is William King suggesting that people are going to be killed by Catholics, and I can drive it home very close to where I live. Our next door neighbors were family Nugents. Andrew Nugent was married to a Catholic woman. He was Protestant. They moved. They were literally my next door neighbors, and they moved to Canaris Mills. So and it was all about the scare. They were being targeted by these Catholic neighbors. So the hit squad was total rumor, speculation by our friend William King. Corrigan Armed Guards. I'm still looking for the Corrigan's body where he is. So I went to see an old chap that I knew, and I asked him. He was a very active Orangeman back about, I'd say about 15 years ago. So where is he buried? Oh, I know nothing, know nothing, know nothing. And then as I'm walking away, he says, hey, Steve, did you know the guards were armed at the wake? I said, what? Well, at Corrigan's wake, all of the people there were armed. I said, no, I didn't know that. So I just thought it was a good piece of oral tradition. Well, in one of the reports in the inquest is John Hume mentioned specifically. John Hume was a high-profile Orangeman in the government inquest after the murder. He specifically said, well, everybody was armed at the wake because we were afraid they were going to rob the body. So my oral tradition was bang on. He had some facts. Because oral tradition's a funny thing. I always worry about facts, rumors, and opinions. And oral tradition sort of floats and is fluid between all of those things. Well, here's a piece of oral tradition that was bang on with the facts. It was really cool. Secret burial. The reason why I'm convinced that Corrigan was buried the first time was probably at St. James Anglican Church, which is where the coroner report was. It's where the funeral was. And that's a bastion of the Orangemen's Hall. The problem is that there were multiple rumors that because of the threat of the body being robbed, that he was reburied a second time. And I didn't believe any of that, except one source that I do have, that I have a lot of confidence, says they're fairly certain that he was removed and buried a second time. And that's the only reason why I can't ascertain as to where he is. But I'm still hopeful we'll find him someday. So there is a secret burial. Another elder chap, no longer with us, told me it was all about drink and Paddy Nelly. I couldn't figure out what he was talking about. When I did the research, lots of drinking at the faction fights, lots of drinking at the party, again at the Corrigan. Some of the guys that were accused were actually quite drunk. And who's Paddy Nelly? Patrick Big O'Neill, right? But he didn't know about Patrick Big O'Neill. He knew about Paddy Nelly. Stoning on the Plains of Abraham. This is a bit of a real stretch on how stories get carried away. Robert Corrigan's wife and kids end up by leaving by 1868, and they go to Ontario, Uffington, and eventually to Rainy River, which is the northwest part of Ontario. And descendants, I've been in touch with them over time. One of the funny, sad. One guy said, yeah, we were told that Robert Corrigan was the last Irish Protestant to be killed by stoning on the Plains of Abraham by the Irish Catholics. So I said, come again? So I heard that story again, and they said, our family didn't like Catholics. I said, okay. But I mean, so it lets you know how stories get fabricated. And I've got that document. I can tell you who told me that. It's a bit of a hoot, right? The Orange Lodges are still around, right? We have an Orange Lodge that's in Kinnair's Mills to this day. The 12th of July, they still have parties. Up until about the 1950s, there were still people staying indoors when they were out partying. They could get carried away if they were in that general area. But for those of us that think that everything was kosher after the trial, there's a fraudulent election in 1858, and the fraudulent election happens to be John O'Farrell, who was also the member of the Legislative Assembly at the time, and he runs in 1858, and he's accused of fraud. And I won't go into the details, but there's little doubt there was lots of stuff that happened. They only had like 700 people, and he got 2,100 votes, right? So there's all sorts of stuff. So he's pulled out, and when he's pulled out, the second thing, the Catholic priest at the time is Sean O'Grady. So Sean O'Grady replaced Father Nelligan in 53, and Sean O'Grady is the bishop is upset because Sean O'Grady should have controlled this community. He didn't, so he's pulled out, and they put a French-Canadian priest, a guy named Drolet, to come in place. Well, when Drolet comes, the Irish Catholics won't let him into the church, right? So they refuse to give him the keys to the church. And this goes on for weeks and weeks. Finally, they come back and they threaten excommunication. And so they finally let them into their Irish church, right? St. Sylvester. So Father Drolet didn't have very many friends. At the end of 59, 60, by pure chance, Dr. McFarlane, who is a doctor in Leeds, and his wife, who's a French-Canadian Catholic, but O'Farrell's an Orangeman, he brings his wife to St. Sylvester to go to church, go to Mass around Christmas time, and there's a major storm. So Father Drolet allows McFarlane and his wife to stay overnight. And the next morning when they get up, their horse has no ears, no tail, and no mane, right? So just the message. So is the message for Father Drolet, or is it for the wife, or is it for the Orangeman? Just to say that these lovely, if you think the Irish Catholics are just painted in like a bunch of angels, they're a little bit on the edge as well. 3 weeks after the trial, Carpenter's barn is burnt with the loss of animals. Accuses the Irishman of burning the barn. And when I first saw that, I didn't believe it. I thought it was just chance. But a month later, Megantic mob rule, Ralph Johnson goes in and calms things down because there's some guys there burning buildings and they were again accused of being ribbonmen. So these ribbonmen aren't the nicest people at the time, so we certainly have a faction of them. And some of the guys at Irish Studies in Quebec, not in Quebec, at Concordia were surprised at the evidence of so many ribbonmen at the time. So not necessarily the easiest neighbors. Last one, surprises. Picture of a lost cemetery. So you know that the issue of the spring skirmish was in front of a chapel. Nobody believed that there was a chapel there. I found records of a chapel. When I found records of the chapel, I found the actual archives at Bishop's, the Anglican archives. And in that, they talked about a cemetery in the next lot over. Well, the Anglicans had lost the cemetery, didn't know where it was. Nobody knew where it was, except for Mon Oncle Joseph, an old chap I met through a conference. And he said, if you go, blah, 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 and down a hill in the middle of nowhere, there's this lost cemetery. And we found 9-10 people that we confirmed that are buried in there, including Robert Corrigan's son, William, who died a few years after his father. And so we have some records of people that are buried in there. But it's a great place. It's very serene in the middle of nowhere. So we found it, and the Anglicans are quite pleased about it. Thomas Cromwell. This is a funny name because Cromwell is such a history with Irish stories, but there is a major Thomas Cromwell witness at this. And what I like about him, he's the only guy that told the truth. Like when they asked him, well, what did you see? Well, we couldn't see because we're surrounded. How many people were there? Maybe 3 or 4, but we couldn't tell who hit them. How long did it last? 4 or 5 minutes. Couldn't have been more than that because so he was almost the only guy that told the truth. So even O'Farrell in the John James O'Hagan trial, even O'Farrell gives Thomas Cromwell credit for being honest. So he says, despite your name, that's the way he said it, despite your name, you're pretty honest. So it's a compliment. And at the same time as I'm writing the book, I just happened to see in the newspaper that Canada has just named a new Supreme Court judge, and his name is Thomas Cromwell. So I contacted him. He's a direct descendant of this guy. And I said, you became a judge only because your ancestors, it's in your DNA. He was an honest man. So I've been in touch with this Thomas Cromwell ever since. But it's a great story. The poem in the middle, a descendant of Corrigan's, sent me a copy of a poem that was floating around in their family. It's 500 lines long, right? All about the murder in perfect prose. So somebody, I don't know who did it. I know where it came from, but I don't know who wrote it. And it's all about the Corgan. The last pages, the last lines start ROBERTCOR, but the poem is, forget the content of the poem because it's very anti-Catholic for sure, but the poem is incredible. So somebody went to an incredible amount of work to write this poem, and I have a copy of it, and it's a bit of a treasure to me. So I know where I got it, and I've been able to trace it back as to where it came from in our area, but we still don't know who wrote it. So it's quite amusing. The medal is something else. Thomas Cromwell's son, Robert Thomas, years later was part of a regiment that was fighting the Fenians, and he won a medal. In the 1890s, they issued medals for people that had taken service in 1866 and 1870 against the Fenians. So I've got a great picture of Robert Thomas's medal, and it's marked his name on the side, St. Sylvester. And when I look at all the people that received this medal from St. Sylvester, there might be 15 of them, they're all Protestant. So none of the Catholics were fighting against the Fenians. It's almost like they were hoping for the Fenians to win. It's an interesting perspective. Municipal records disappeared for 3 years around the Corrigan murder. You go into the archives, or the papers are gone. They're ripped out of the book, like it's literally. So somebody literally took them out. So you can't read what the municipality was reacting during this thing. Ralph Johnson, he's the stipendiary counsel that reads. The constable that is placed. What I found out is a former soldier, Napoleonic War, high profile. By the time he comes to St. Sylvester, he's almost 70 years old. And everybody was petrified of him. Like, he's a military man. He came with military, and he just calmed everybody down. So he gained credibility with the Orangemen because he took a hard line on some of the foolishness that was occurring with the barn burning in Inverness. And for the Catholics, he really put them in their place to calm things down. And I found that he's buried outside of Magog. I found his headstone, but another whole story on Johnson that I've sent out to a number of members. I keep on stumbling on names. Hugh Russell, the guy that tried to make the deal with the neighbor to calm things down in the spring of '55 with Corrigan, he's involved in a murder. He's a chief witness of a murder in 1833. So his name appeared there, and he was a witness, a significant witness at that. Jean-Baptiste Napierre lied through his teeth here. Well, he lies through his teeth in 1886. He and his son and a father-in-law are accused of killing a man with a scythe in 1886. He spent almost a year and a half in prison and finally was released. Patrick Donoghue, another guy involved with another murder having to do with his cousin Hugh Donoghue. So they're all involved, so these names kept on popping up. So that's what I know those families by heart, only because I had to make sure I didn't tell you it was your Patrick Donoghue that did it versus his Patrick Donoghue. So I've got to know them quite well. William King, Mary Hyde are buried in St. Sylvester, and the funniest thing about it, when you see their headstone, it's William King, big cemetery stone, blah, 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 and down here, Mary Hyde, she doth done what she could. And I thought, what a great quote. It tells you exactly anything you need to know about the story. Sad cemetery splits. A number of the players involved, whether it's Walker, William Love, the families are split. They married mixed marriages, so one's buried in St. Sylvester, the other one's in St. Patrick. So the Catholics, at death, these couples that have been together for 40, 50 years, but that's the pressure at the time. Last thing is stevedores. John McCaffrey, the gentleman that had the sheep, that was the owner of the sheep, and we have a headstone, he was killed working as a stevedore here in Quebec City within 2 years of the murder. We did not know locally that we had people locally that left our area to work as stevedores as part-time. We had lots of evidence of going to work in the woods in the States. Didn't have them coming here. So now I've up to 3 or 4 different guys that have left our area, come to Quebec to work as stevedores. So a little bit of a surprise for us, all because of the Corrigan murder. This is a quote from Darcy McGee, referring to this excitement. He says, "The trial excited the bitterest of animosities. In its origin, it seems to have been a mere quarrel between 2 irritable and physically powerful men, both of whom were egged on by bad advisors to prosecute the quarrel." And I don't like disagreeing with somebody with that insight and that perspective. And I think he's partially right. But what also happened about the Corrigan story is it got politicized and it got religiousized. I'm not sure how to use that. People use it to really put a split in the community for years. And I can tell you, up until the 1950s, 60s in our area, there wasn't too much going and flowing between the two grades. And someone asked, well, why is it so different today? I said, well, I think there's so few of us around. Like, and all of a sudden, the Anglos have the thing in common. Religion doesn't play the role that it played 50 or 60 years ago. But I can remember when I'm a kid, like a number of years ago, don't say how many, a number of years ago, but I remember my older cousins, when they started going to dances, when they were dancing with a Protestant boy, my uncle kept a close eye. Like it was almost that generation that actually broke the tradition so that things are normal again, but it's rather special. So this Corrigan story, when I wrote the book and when I started talking about it, I had 2 people come to me from Canaris Mills and say, "You're not going to tell that story here, are you?" And I did. So this is the result of Mariana's prodding was this story. She promised to, she told me that if I didn't write the book, she would haunt me. This she told me 2 days before she passed away. So I told her I would, finally, and she wrote it in her little book. And then I said, but I didn't say when. She says, the haunt can occur anytime. So I wrote, 2014, I wrote the book, and it set me off on it. So I wasn't finished with that. I found 9 other murders, lots of other crazy stories, and 2 other books. And this is conference number 100. And the first one was here in October 2009, and here we are X number of years later. So to Mariana, Gora mila maga. Thank you very much, Mariana, for all your help. Thank you for listening. I realize that's a bit long, but technical. Any questions? Can I answer any questions? Otherwise, I'll have to tell you something, you know? I need a question. Yep.
I'm surprised at the way they export the animosity, you know, that they, I would have think that when they moved the Irish to Canada, Quebec, they would have been pleased to leave behind them, you know, all the...
Yeah, but they didn't.
No, they didn't. But they didn't have the... But they didn't have any laws that were helping them. Like in Ireland, they had all those laws.
Yeah, well...
In Canada, they were not, you cannot have a horse that size.
No. I think what happened here is certainly all of them, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, were surprised when they did get here, especially the first ones that get here, are given free land with some conditions. But it's based, whether you're in the seigneurie or whether you're in the township, you're given land with conditions. So they're certainly better off than they would have been at home to begin with. But then to start off, then it didn't take long before the tradition started. And my sense is that individuals sort of got along with neighbors, but when institutions got involved, my sense is, whether it's the Orange Lodge, Ribbonmen, whether it's the Catholic Church or William King, and when those institutions seem to get involved, it just takes the animosities, and it's almost like they crystallize the animosities for whatever reason, right? So my sense is that's why I said I agree with McGee. The two fighters are two fighters. They like fighting, but this got carried away, right? Yep. Another question.
What's the other names for the ribbonmen you were talking about?
Yes. What?
Synonyms, other names.
Other names for the other ribbonmen, or the other names? The only name I've ever heard here in Canada used in our area was called ribbonmen, but in Ireland, Molly Maguires, White Boys, all sorts of strange names.
Okay, and they were Catholic at first, and then they...
No, those guys are the ones that I've just described. They're all Catholic. Those are Irish Catholic agrarian movements. Orangemen. They're the Orangemen.
Yeah, are they developed ribbonmen too?
No, they're not. No, they're not ribbonmen. Orangemen are Orangemen. Ribbonmen are Catholics. Separate, all sorts of different rules. One thing that was interesting and just made me think of it. Someone said, well, they really wanted to kill Corrigan. And I'm not convinced they did. Because when you know the territory, like I know where he lived, and I know where all these guys lived, and I know where the spring skirmish was. If they wanted to kill him, you would have never found him. He'd be buried somewhere, but you wouldn't have found him. Because there was all sorts of places to do that. You wouldn't choose a place where there's 300 or 400 people watching you do it, right? So I think this is a case of people being overzealous and beat him up and wanted to get him because they didn't like him. They wanted to beat him up badly. But I'm not sure the objective was to kill him. That's an opinion, for what it's worth. Now, there is quotes of a guy, John J. Hagan, who's drinking a lot. He says, well, let's kill them all. Right? So there are quotes saying that, but that's booze talking, I think. Not again, you still wouldn't do that in front of a few hundred people. Right? Any other question? No? Yep.
If you could say more about how this played out in the city, in Quebec City, among Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants.
Yeah, I won't translate the time period here, right? Because there's some evidence of funding coming to the ribbonmen from Quebec City. Don't forget, Nelligan, Father Nelligan, has left St. Sylvester to here. So he's here. So there's insinuations that he was involved with helping to get support to the Irish Catholic. But it's insinuations. Again, it comes back to this fact, rumor, opinion. I don't find any fact of that. And usually when it's just oral tradition, I try to stay away from it. There's also insinuations that there were pieces of armor, like guns, little cannons, brought from Quebec to St. Sylvester when Ralph Johnson appears to calm things down. Again, it's one source, speculation, so it's a bit, I'm afraid, I don't want to say it was like that here, but there's certainly support, there's certainly moral support, and when O'Farrell, at the end of the trial, when O'Farrell and company leave with the not guilty, big party time in Quebec City, beyond people from St. Agathe, St. Sylvester. So there's people here supporting him, there's no doubt about that, right? And don't forget, it's just a year and a half after the Gavazi riots where he again has protected a pile of Irish Catholic, where there was lots of support here. So, but I wouldn't want to translate the open fighting, that'd be unfair, I think. All right?